many full-time equivalent employees you can have. So obviously when we see 17 point something, we're not going to have a half a person, but it might be that somebody's working part-time hours, and so you can roughly adjust for that. This column P right here, this may be what you proposed. So what I often say is you shouldn't even look at column P because this shouldn't have any impact on how you're figuring out your staff budget workbook. Column N I think is helpful because you're actually looking at your payroll reports and what you're doing. This is telling you what you're budgeted for hour-wise in a pay period. So that way you can see what your fluctuation is on a very routine every 2-week basis. But again, the fact that we have the HMM, this is really helpful as well, although I know it doesn't total up the hours. Are there any questions on this page or how to look at items on this page? No? Okay. So what I did here is I created a budget staff workbook with all of you being part of it, as you can see. Amanda is a CSR for us. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to start and plug in every single employee that you have. I didn't plug in the hire dates here. Their name, their position, how many hours a week they work, what their currently hourly rate is, and again, when it comes to budget time, what the proposed hourly increase is going to be. And then this right here will automatically figure out for you. Now, if you get something here where it becomes blank, what it means is that you deleted the formula. So what you can always do if you accidentally delete a formula, which I'll just do right now, take it out of there, it's not in there, you can just copy from another cell and paste it in there, and it'll automatically refigure the formula for you.
Oh.
So that's the way that you can do it, because if you do press delete, it's actually taking out the formula that's in there, so you're not going to have correct numbers. But if you copy from a different cell, it'll repaste that formula with the correct numbers in there. Any questions on this? So a couple things that I've, go ahead.
Am I muted? This is Rochelle, and I'm not sure if I'm muted. I guess I'm not.
I can hear you. You're
okay.
not.
Okay, I'm sorry. I came on at like 4 after. Is it *3 to mute myself for you? Because I have a doctor working in the office with me.
What you can do is see the little green phone button at the top of your screen. If you click on that and it turns gray, it will mute you.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt, guys.
So just a couple things to point out here. If you have people that are working routinely overtime, they're on here, you're going to want to try to figure out those hours some way. I mean, ideally, we don't want to schedule people for routine overtime, but you do want to look at it on here. It's not going to be an exact science, but if you feel like you're going to have scheduled overtime, then we can always have a one-off call and look at that. The other thing just to consider on here is to make sure that you don't have data entry errors. So a lot of times what I can see when people are completing these is in this column, they put in what the recommended increase is. So they actually put in 25 cents, $1, or 75 cents rather than what the actual rate will be. So just make sure that we're entering in what the actual rate is going to be once we fill this out. And I've added a few columns that I think will actually update it a little bit. If you have open positions, so positions where somebody left but you haven't replaced them yet, somebody to be determined, and what you expect their pay rate to be, you want to make sure you put these down here as well. Then, in this lovely little box right here, it's going to tell you what your actual hours are every single week, what your average hourly rate is, and I'm going to just do the proposed rate here, and what the overall percentage increase is. So what I like to do so that I don't have to go back and forth between the budget is actually put in numbers what my budget is. So what I did here is I just took the average budget from what we just looked at. 701 hours is what we're budgeted for. And in case there's any confusion, I'll just show people. This is where I got that number, the 701. It's just doing the average right here and finding the 701. It wouldn't be a bad idea to plug the 695 in, just because that way at least you're having a little bit more wiggle room in the budget. And the more wiggle room you can make, the more flexible you can be, and the more autonomy you're going to be able to have because there's going to be room. If you're always working at maximum budget, it's really going to be hard to have changes if you want to give people pay increases without making adjustments to schedules and people's hours. So to start it out this way and give yourself wiggle room, I would always recommend doing it that way. So that's where I'm getting my numbers from on the budget staff workbook. So the first thing we can see here is that we're budgeted for 701 hours, but we actually have people working 748 hours. So the difference is 47 hours. So what does that mean in terms of people, 47 hours?
You have a little more than one person more than you should.
Exactly. Thank you. So we're about 40 hours over, technically 47, so about one person more than we should. Sometimes we can make that up by what our hourly rate is and to look up what our total weekly staff costs are. So the other thing that I put over here from our budget, and again I took the average, I didn't take the lowest and I didn't take the highest, was $16.03. The actual, sorry I changed this, was $16.54. Just change this real quick. So when we're looking at our budget, we're actually budgeted to spend $11,000, just a little over $11,000 a week on staff costs. Where we're coming in is actually more than that. And let me just change this to $16.54 so that it's correct. So now we can see what our difference is as far as this part goes. So we're actually spending more than this every single month. This is $60,000 more than we're budgeted to spend in a year. So when we see something like this come across, we can basically say, okay, what adjustments or tweaks can we now make to help support this so that we can be within budget? Does everybody understand the numbers that we're looking at so far and where I'm getting them from? Because I know it's a lot of information. Okay. Does anybody have any thoughts on how we could adjust or help our budget, our workbook at this point to try and actually meet budget? Okay. So Patrice, you might be on mute, but I know you and I just went through this. So do you have any thoughts or tips and tricks on how we could tweak this?
Sure. We tweaked it somewhat by changing the rates. You know, instead of going up 25 cents, maybe you went up 20 cents. And as far as the hours are concerned, you know, there might be people that you could have working 39 instead of 40. Your difference is not that huge. You have a pretty large staff there. So doing an hour here and an hour there would help, and doing 10 cents less of a raise would help too.
Right. So I think those are both really great points. And I think specifically on this staff budget workbook that we're looking at, you're absolutely right. And so one thing that I would notice on this workbook as I'm looking at it is we have 4 open positions at this point. So one thing we might want to ask ourselves is, do we really need all 4 of these positions to be filled? And if the answer is absolutely yes, okay, that's one. Number 2 would be, can any of these be part-time positions? Can we adjust any of these to be 20 hours or less? And number 3, what I think is the most important and the most significant impact that you can make, and you can see how some of our numbers will change, is what if we brought these people in instead of at 40 hours, at 30 or 32 hours? So 30 hours is the minimum normally to get benefits and things like that. Some people might have full-time status a little bit different at their hospital to get vacation-type benefits. So I would just say, if you want someone to be at full-time status, what does your handbook say as far as what those hours are? Because if even right here we just cut these to 30, 32, 34, and 30 again, look at what it does to our hours by just making those 4 simple adjustments. And so these are for people that we haven't hired yet. And the other thing that we can look at for people we haven't hired yet when you have flexibility like that is, what are their hourly rates? Are we still competitive? What if we change this? You know, what if we're able to find somebody to come in that's a licensed technician at 18 instead of 20? You can see what those differences make right down here as well. The other thing to look at is if you don't have, go ahead.
Yeah, where did you get the, down at the bottom of your sheet, the weekly staff cost budget? Where did that come from to compare with your actual?
Right. So what I did is I actually went to our budget right here. And so what I did is I took this average right here, which was the 701. So I'm just going to do, Excel is lovely because you can use it as a calculator. So I do 701 and then multiply it, and then I took our average wage. And I think that everybody should do this on their workbook so you don't have to flip back and forth. Because can I do that as a cut into? Which I think, I don't want 839. There we go. All right, 1603. Oops. Okay. So I just took that here and then I copied and pasted it over here.
Okay.
Because this way, for me, it's so much easier if you can look at this. And so that's what I would say. Your budget, once you get the budget for the year, your budget isn't going to change. So what I would recommend to everybody is that you can create it however you want. You don't have to follow my model, but that you set it up so that you can see what your difference is and where you're going. And the other thing that's helpful about doing this,
that's a great visual,
right?
Because, you know, seeing a difference of $1,000 a pay period, okay, or a week, no big deal. Okay, 60,000, that's a big deal.
Right, right. And this also, I mean, I think one of the biggest things, especially as managers, and obviously when I'm a manager as well, is you want to have autonomy to make decisions and make changes, especially when it comes to the staff. That's not something that, you know, people are like, woo, I want to call Genevieve or Diana, you know, and get permission to do something. Is really having a good understanding of how this works and making adjustments accordingly. You do have the autonomy to make decisions about whether or not you want to give somebody a pay increase. Is it in your budget to hire somebody else that's within there? And keep in mind, what we're talking about today is just, you know, I'm going to call it budget, you know, training 101. We'll have a different financial call. If we're looking to add staff or grow to work beyond the budget, we'll do that as a part 2 budget call. This is really how do we work within our budget, assuming that we're hitting our revenue targets every single month. Because if we're not hitting our revenue targets every single month, then we may need to make further adjustments. But for me, this is a good way to see. And you can also, you know, punch in every single month, what are your estimated weekly hours for the month and what's your wages for the month? And that way you can really keep the most up-to-date on it as you see it, because it does fluctuate. And with that, there may be some tweaks to the schedule, and that's what we want to look at going forward. So this is a budget here where I would say we probably need to make some changes. If we're just hitting our revenue every single month, it's going to be hard to sustain this, and especially because here we have the opportunity to change how we're going to maybe hire people and what hours they're going to be hired in at. The other thing to look at is, you know, as we hire more people and have that flexibility, you may hire them and say, we're going to guarantee you, you know, 32 hours full-time for as long as we can. You have a really busy week, you might schedule them for 40 hours, but the guarantee is 32. And that way we're not ever having to say to somebody, hey, we're going to need to cut your hours or reduce it. This is something where it's like we might be able to give you extra hours, but not necessarily have to cut it. And that's the part that I like about being able to have this flexibility and being able to tweak it. And again, you want to look at what your average staff costs are and where they are, and if we're having these big jumps. So if this is 3.5% increase here, and we'll go into this a little bit more, but your overall price increases came to 2%, that's going to be a hard thing to, you know, be able to increase the staff cost if the price increases aren't going to justify it. Because if our prices just consistently stay the same, but our staff costs keep going up, 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 that's where we're going to see our percentage of labor continually go up. And we're not going to be able to justify a 40% staff cost in 5 years when prices don't get adjusted. Any questions on that? So one thing to look at is just the staff budget workbook as we're going through there, and I just did. What's included? So this is all support staff is included on the staff budget workbook. Now, if you're a hospital that has boarding and grooming, you may have a separate budget for that, and you may even want to, depending on how big your grooming department is, you may even want to have a separate staff workbook for that so that you can manage the two independently as you look at it. The other thing that you want to make sure you're including on here is yourself. How do you determine your hourly rate? Again, this is on the instructions, but it's pretty simple. You just take your annual salary and divide it by 2,080. The 2,080 comes from you work 40 hours a week, 52 weeks in a year, multiply those together, that's 2,080. So if we just take if your annual salary is 50,000, you divide that by 2,080, then your average wage on there would be $24.04. Does anybody have questions about how they would compute their own wage and just making sure that you're including yourself on there? Okay. So the other thing that I just briefly reviewed too was the wage percentage increase, what we're proposing versus what your actual price increases are. And so that's where you as a manager get to find a happy balance, because we don't want you to up your price increases 7% because you want to give your staff 7% pay increases. We want to make sure that we're doing, you know, what's reasonable for your clients, where does that leave you with your competition, what's going to be reasonable going forward. So those are things as managers you really need to think about and take that into account about what can we do, what's reasonable. There may be years where you can't quite do the 3.5% to 5% price increases depending on where you are in the market. But just realize in doing that, that's going to help pay for your increased staff costs year over year. So the other thing is, and I know Genevieve talked about this on her last call, what is the support staff labor percentage based off of? Is it total revenue, professional services revenue, ancillary service revenue? Who knows the answer to that?
I think it's total revenue.
Okay. Any other guesses?
Professional services revenue.
Okay. Any other guesses? So, no, Dana, you're correct. It is based off of professional services revenue. So just like the DVM cost, the ancillary service revenue, that's not what your actual percentage is based off. So the answer is B. So that's something to think about as we're talking about things and how things are going to affect our labor increases. While your revenue might go up on your statement of ops, if it's only going up on your ancillary services, we should see your staff costs and that labor percentage remain exactly the same. So the one thing that I would say too is the more familiar you can get with this, get with the budgets. I know not everybody loves numbers, but I think that as you look at them more often, you will get more comfortable with it. So one thing I would say is when we're looking at your staff budget and making adjustments, the first thing you want to do is check your payroll report. Is how many hours you're actually using, is that reflective of what's on your staff budget workbook? If you're consistently coming in under on those weekly hours on your staff budget workbook, it might be time to update your workbook again because what's being reflected for the last 3 months, if you're actually coming in at 670 hours, that's giving you more flexibility. So we should look at that and see what's going on there. Number 2 is when we do have new employees come in, really think about starting them at hours below 40 hours for full-time employees, and even for part-time employees, can we start them at less than 20 hours or whatever your part-time is considered? That can make a huge adjustment on your staff budget. You saw how we, just by changing 4 employees, that almost brought us down to our budget numbers just on hourly rates alone. The other thing that I think is something that's hard to struggle with, but I think as you are with your hospital longer and longer, are we adjusting the schedule as we need to? So if we have a doctor that's going to be on vacation for 2 weeks, is that going to change how many clients we're seeing? Is it going to change the revenue that's in the door? How can we reflect the schedule to help accommodate those changes? Our Oregon hospitals just went through a nightmare with their little mini blizzard going on, and if you're having to shut down for days or that clients are going to be limited to get in there on weather conditions, we should change the staffing to help with that as well. The other thing, as all of you know, is there's the unexpected events that happen routinely. We don't expect, we don't know what's going on. If it's going to be something long-term, how do we make those adjustments to help accommodate for those unexpected events? Because if we have permanent changes, even if doctors are on maternity leave for 3 months, while we certainly don't want to reduce everybody's hours for that 90-day period, we should look at and say, what can we do to help support this? Some of that might be adjusting the hours. Some of it might be trying to get revenue in different ways. But this is something that you should forecast and anticipate for those events that are expected. Any questions on that? So when can I make adjustments to the schedule and staff pay? So I would say this is a question that I get most routinely, and something that I just want to reiterate on here is each of you were chosen to be managers in your hospitals. We all, you're entrusted to run multi-million-dollar businesses, really, and to do that. And a big key component of that is staff costs, and how do we manage staff costs and labor? So one thing I would say is you do have the autonomy to do that. We do trust you to run those businesses, come there. The number one way to do it, as I said before, is keep your staff budget workbook up to date. If you don't have a current staff budget workbook, it's going to be hard to know what you need and what you don't need. So keep that up to date at all times and look at your labor reports and say, is this reflecting what's on my workbook? The other thing is once the final budget comes out for the year, compare to what your actual costs are on that budget to what's in your workbook, because they may vary. And that may be where we then have a conversation about, okay, what are we going to do to try to make this work, right? It also doesn't mean that, if you come in way under budget that you want to necessarily go on a hiring spree if the current staff you have is working. It just may give you some more flexibility to make choices in the future. So again, this is where you get to really make some decisions as the hospital manager and really empower yourself and your team for what you want to do. The other thing that I like to do all the time if we're doing things and looking at a staff budget workbook is let's plug in changes all the time. You can always make a copy. What's going to happen if we change this person to X? What if I can replace this person at $1 less? How can we make this work and functional for everybody? So I say make the changes on the workbook, and we'll go back in there and we'll make some more changes as we go too, and really just see how it comes about. And I'd say the final thing is too is expect the unexpected. We all know that there are fires that creep up every single day. I think Shauna had a fire where she had to leave, in the middle of this call. So let's think about expect the unexpected. What's going to happen here, and what are some choices that we have? If we're able to have a few more part-time employees, and then if somebody leaves or goes on leave, we're able to then utilize them for 40 hours to help cover shifts without having overtime. That might be something that's really good for your hospital and your budget. So that's the big thing that I would say. Amanda, I know I talked about throwing you on the spot a little bit, and Amanda does a phenomenal job at managing her staff costs. What do you do, or what are some tips and tricks that maybe you want to share with everybody?
Oh gosh, I'm kind of a staff hour Nazi over here. So I really keep the majority of my full-time employees between like 35 and 37 hours, which is usually really great for them because they all have things that they do in their outside lives. I usually have at least one part-time person on staff too, and I have a lot of really flexible people, so that's really helpful that I have that staff to start with. But I do my hours and my budgeting every single day, and I forecast out usually about 3 or 4 days at a time to kind of watch my trends and see, am I up, am I down, is it a weird week, are we having weird weather, do I have 2 doctors out of the office at the same time, those kind of issues. And then I work with both my back office lead and my front office lead to talk about little things we can do here and there. So if everybody takes an hour lunch today, what's that going to do? If we have one person come in half an hour late and one person leave half an hour early, all those just tiny little things really add up in the end. And I actually, when I do my HMM, I undercut my number by my benefits percent, rounded up, just so that I can't actually see the full total that I have. Because that way, when I'm close to the total that I have, I know that I'm still not quite at that number yet. So I try really, really hard to keep it just underneath. And I definitely have more people than the workbook says I'm supposed to have, but it works out for me because of our traffic and the flexibility of the people that I do have. So.
Right, fantastic. Thank you for that. Dana Copenhaver, I know with staff costs too, I know I'm throwing you on the spot here a little bit, but I know you guys made shifts to just people's lunches, and that made a huge impact. Would you mind just sharing what your process was there and the impact it had on your staff costs?
Well, we've been struggling with labor, and one of the things that we were discovering was, in the morning, we need a certain number of people on hand, checking in procedures, etc. And then, again, mid to late afternoon and before close, again, we needed a certain number of people. We've got appointments going on. We've got surgeries going home. So the number of people that we would have working made sense, but the number of hours always seemed to be too much. And so what Dr. Virgin and I kind of came up with was having everyone take hour-long lunches. And in the past, it was only 30-minute or 40-minute. And that way, in the middle of the day, when we didn't have the need for certain people to be on, we were able to get rid of a lot of hours, basically. So for us, it made all the difference in the world. And for the for the team, they really aren't missing out on a lot of hours. We're talking 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And who doesn't want an hour-long lunch? So that's what worked for us.
Thank you for that. And that's what I would say too, is her percentage went down so much from just making that one little change. So as you think about what changes you want to make, that can be a really huge difference. Does anybody else have anything they've done to help with staff costs? Any questions for Dana or Amanda? Okay. So we'll go one more way. So the other thing that I think people, as we use the HMM, which is a great tool, the more you use it, the more familiar you get with it, is one thing I would say is define and analyze the cause. Why are staff costs increased? And what I would say is the most common thing that we see is staff costs are up because of overtime or training. And so one thing that would be really helpful for you to know, and is helpful for us as well, is let's define why. So if we think it's training, excuse me, let's look at how many actual hours for the training were used and how much money that was. Because if we see, 2 weeks into the month on your HMM, you're over $1,500 in staff costs, and of that, there's a $300 extra because of training, there's still $1,200 that we're going to need to define to figure out the why. Does everybody feel like they would know how to do that or how to dig deeper into the why?
I think so.
Thanks for that, Dana. So that's one thing that I would say too, is let's look at that. If we say overtime is really the cause of the elevated staff costs, look on your HMM and see. If our staff costs, again, are over $2,000 and overtime's just $400 of that, we still have $1,600 we need to determine. And so there's only going to be so many reasons why staff costs are over. So let's see. Cher, do you want to maybe give us a couple items of why you think staff costs, causes why staff costs could be over?
Most of the time what I notice is they're over because people didn't get to take their lunches, or we have some sort of an event like a team meeting that we keep people late for. What we did in our hospital was we did the same thing Dana did, in that we increased the lunch hours from a half an hour to an hour, which I actually got a lot of pushback on. People didn't want to take an hour, but too bad. And then it was also the closing process, trying to make the closing process more efficient so people didn't spend so long after work doing things and finding things we could do throughout the day, finding things that maybe could be done weekly instead of daily, and I think that made a little bit of a difference too.
Okay, thank you for that. And so I think that's a great point that Cher brings up, is staff meetings can, cause the staff costs to go over. So one thought that you want to have is not, what I would say is try to think in terms of absolute. So if you say, I think my staff costs went over probably because, or they should get better next week, let's actually define that and let's find out if there's a cause. So if we have a staff meeting, we know that we had 8 people work an extra 2 hours, so that we know that, okay, that's going to be an extra 16 hours on this week's payroll. Is that what's causing the difference? If it is the overtime, if it is that we're paying out sick time and it's an extra 40 hours for some person that we're doing that, is that really the difference that we're seeing on there? So what I would say is definitely analyze that, look at those numbers, and give yourself some hard data to find out why. And 2, it's going to make you feel better, because then you're going to be able to know what you can anticipate for the next week, right? And so for me, it's important as we look at staff costs and ongoing, is this a one-off? We had to pay people out for vacation last week. There was an extra 120 hours. We know we're not going to have that again the week after or the month after. And that's really what I want you to monitor as managers, is this going to be an ongoing issue, or is this just a weekly thing that's come up? And if we do have staff meetings, do we need to make up for those costs in some way? There may not be a way to work around it, but that's something that we want to think about. If you're having 3 staff meetings a month at 2 hours each, it may be, okay, let's maybe see if we can condense those a little bit, because that seems to be a lot for everybody to come in and do. So I would just say definitely use your HMM. I don't think I have one open right now. I don't want to put anybody on the spot to do it, but use your HMM and look at it. And so one thing that I like to do when I'm looking at people's staff costs on the HMM is we have what your total monthly budget is for staff costs. And so if we see that your total monthly budget for staff costs is $20,000, and we see up in the top that you're 50% through the month, and you've spent $12,000, I can tell just from looking at that we're going to be $2,000 over in staff costs. So what I would say is look at that. And so while the percentage is important to know, the percentage that we're looking at of what you're actually spending is based off your revenue. And so if you just want to know if you're meeting budget, you know, if your revenue's off, maybe it was a unavoidable thing. Ultimately, we want you to work into the actual revenue, but for intents and purposes of this training, it's just how do we work within our budget. That's really what you want to look at. If you're 67% through the month, you want to look at that $20,000, say multiply it by 0.67, and that's where your actual labor cost should be. And that way you can know how much am I over. And then you can see right there, this is what we paid in overtime, this is what we paid in sick time. Is that actually the cause? If it's not, it might be what people are actually scheduled. And then the other thing to look at is what are we actually paying people. So let me just, are there any questions on any of this so far? No? Do you guys feel like you're learning anything new? Maybe, okay. So let's just, for intents and purposes, I'm going to change this a little bit and just say that we're going to decide not to hire this person at all. We're now at $684. Do you guys see how my hourly rate went up by making that change?
Yep.
Does anybody know why the hourly rate went up when I actually took somebody off of our schedule?
You're designing it by fewer people.
Say that again?
Your actual number of hours, you're dividing it by less people.
Right. And what happened is I also took out somebody who was scheduled to make less money.
Mm-hmm.
So as we take this as well. So that's one thing to note is you may take a person off and actually see your hourly rate go up. It depends on where they are and what they're doing for your overall average. If you take the highest number out of your average, you know, your average hourly rate is going to go down. So this is why you want to keep an eye on this number as we keep going through. So although I just decreased the hours, this just went up a little bit. So we can see now by making adjustments just to these people and taking somebody off, we now have a little bit of wiggle room in our budget. We can multiply it again as we look at that. If we then go through and say, Cher said to me, Diana, I want to give so-and-so a raise. Can I give so-and-so a raise? And this is now what we're looking at, 1686. Again, we'd want to just multiply this on here. Let me do this in 1686. And we can make this so it's an ever-changing formula so you don't have to do what I'm doing each time. Sorry about that. Why aren't you pasting? So we're still a little bit better. So if this is what we actually look like, and Cher then says, okay, well, I want to give so-and-so a raise. I want to give Danny a raise to $15 an hour. We're going to just plug that in and then just see what that does. So that now brings us to $16.95. Does everybody see that?
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on that? Do we give the raise? Do we not give the raise?
I mean, it looks like you're still under budget, so it should be okay maybe.
Yeah. I don't disagree with you, Cher. Any other thoughts? Christina, what do you think?
I mean, I would give it just based on the numbers, seeing that it's still under budget just by not hiring or not having an open position for that one person.
Right. Right. And I don't disagree with you. I think that you can
Yeah,
look
you're
at this.
still under weekly, you're still under annually for what you're budgeted for, so.
Okay, good. Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. But I guess one thing I would say too that I might ask myself too is that brings us a lot closer to what our number is coming to, as to Amanda's point as we're looking at this. So this gives us just a little under $200 of flexibility every week. So what I like to account for is there going to be overtime this week? Are we going to have to, pay somebody vacation and then somebody else to fill that spot? This is where I'd want to look at my historical payroll data and say, where am I actually coming in? Am I actually coming in at what my workbook says? Am I consistently paying this much overtime per week? The other thing you can do is look at your HMMs historically. Where are we actually falling? So what I might say here is I don't necessarily oppose giving somebody a raise, and I certainly would be open to hearing to it. But I guess my other thought is taking somebody from from $13 an hour to $15 an hour, that's a pretty big jump. So 10% alone would be $1.30. So I guess my thought would be too is I'm open to this, but do we really feel like a $2 jump is appropriate? And then what expectations are we setting for this person for the future?
Right, so if they've maybe got more responsibilities or it's somewhat of a promotion, then I think it may be warranted. Otherwise, it may be something to talk about.
Yeah, and I'm with you 100% because I think part of that is just thinking about, as managers, what's the big picture? Because if Danny now goes and tells Sarah, Wendy, and Jacob, I just got a $2 pay increase, which legally she has every right to talk about it if she wants to, then they may all come and say, well, we want $2 increases too. So what I would say is, as managers, just think about what do you want to do, what's appropriate, and what's the expectation that we're setting for the future. And I really like what, to Cher's point, what she just said is, are we giving somebody much more responsibility if we're giving them these much bigger increases, and we're looking going forward is what we're going to do. Because the other thing that we want to look at too is, where are we with our percentage increase now? So this is also going to limit us, and when we're giving this person a $2 increase, if Christina comes later and says, hey, to the manager, I really want to get a pay increase, $1 that may have been available for her to give, we've just given both of those dollars to Danny. And so that's something as managers that you want to figure out and really think about and forecast is, who else maybe is eligible for a raise? Who else do I want to look at? Is there a way that I can split up this that I've allocated for a few other people? And this is where I would say playing with this, going back and forth and seeing what tweaks we're making, that can make the biggest difference in the world. Because I want you to have the autonomy to do that, but sometimes it's hard to think about all the moving pieces that go with it. Any other questions? Okay. So the other question that I get quite a bit too is, why does my statement of my labor costs look so different than what it looks like on my HMM? And so the really easy thing for that is, on our HMM, we're not accounting for what our benefits cost. And so there can be some confusion as far as what benefits are, and I can tell you that every hospital, their benefit percentage varies quite a bit. So just keep in mind that when you're looking at your actual statement of ops, this is including what your benefit percentage is. So if you want to know closer what's my statement of ops going to look like, you can take your HMM labor costs and add what your benefit percentage is that you see on your budget. So right now we know for this hospital, 18% is what's allocated for their benefit percentage. And you may say, well, I don't actually pay people vacation, we don't have, pay time off, we don't have holidays. Usually the biggest portion of this is going to be what your portion of workers' comp is, what your portion as far as taxes go, really all the things that it takes to employ employees. And so that's why you'll see a big variance from hospital to hospital and what we do with that benefit percentage. But that's what your difference is there. And that's why on the HMM, we don't use this column for the monthly, because this includes that 18%. You could take this number and subtract the 18% from it, and that should get you pretty close to what your figures are that you do on your HMM. So what questions does anybody have as far as creating and managing a staff workbook? I know there has to be some questions out there. Patty, do you have any questions? Does anybody have their staff budget workbook in front of them? Muted. That's okay.
sorry. Anyways, no, you explained it very clearly. I always worked off of the matrix that, oh my goodness, John Hammerson sent me, gosh, years ago. So I wrote myself an email note to have you email me the template that you're talking about, see if it's different from what Don said.
Okay, good. And Linda, I know you're on the call. Go ahead.
Sorry, this is Patrice. I have a question. So when you say to keep the workbook up to date, you're not going to be changing the hourly rates. What you're going to be changing is the average hours per week, right? In order to, because theoretically your rate's going to stay the same for a period of time, whether it's a year or whatever. So the things that you're going to be changing are whether you're changing the number of employees or someone's leaving or whatever, or changing the actual hours that are worked.
Right, but it may be, in your circumstance, you went through and you did pay increases at the same time, but in a lot of cases, the pay increases may be staggered based on what they got the year before or at different times. So you may be changing people's hourly rates throughout the year depending on how your pay increases are set up and how you do them for employees. Some people may do them associated with performance reviews. So Jake might get a raise in September and somebody else might get one, in May. So that's where I just say, as they change and we make these adjustments, and as we hire new people, that's why I always like to have the current workbook, because then you can kind of know, okay, what room do I have, what flexibility? And even if you're doing really well with staff costs, but you know that you have a doctor that's going on maternity leave, somebody gave their 2 weeks notice, that might be where you just say, do I need to replace this person? Should I wait until the doctor's back from maternity leave? These are factors that, sometimes it's harder to fluctuate, but when you have openings or turnover, that's when you have the greatest opportunity to really make an impact on your staff budget.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Does anybody have their workbook in front of them and want to share where they fall in relation to budget?
Hey, this is Linda.
Hi, Linda.
Hello. Because Washington State just changed to $11 an hour minimum wage,
Right.
We had a ton of impact. Because we did, unfortunately, because about half our staff was underneath that $11 an hour weight. But because we also lost our lead LVT, our one of two LVTs, our percentage increase is a negative number in spite of the changes in the minimum wage.
Right.
So sometimes actually putting the numbers down on paper and running the calculator on them is going to give you an answer that you didn't really expect. So yeah, filling out the form seems kind of, at the face of it, seems sometimes like it's a, just a little paperwork exercise, but it can actually give you some interesting numbers.
Good. I know. And Linda, I mean, yeah, that's been interesting. And I think I'm glad that you brought up the minimum wage, because obviously that wasn't an impact that our Washington hospitals were necessarily expecting, and certainly some had greater impact than others. And this is where I think, too, as a manager, it's time to get creative and do it, because obviously we're going to be compliant with the law. It changes the dynamic. I know Hannah and her hospital have dealt with it, and really all of our Washington hospitals. And so that's where I would say is we're not necessarily going to say, okay, we're not going to adjust staff or do it, but really to be able to kind of think about the future and how we're going to make some changes with that. And so, Amanda, can I throw you on the spot again, because I know you've done a lot of thought about the minimum wage impact and just kind of what your thought process was at your hospital as far as how you guys are going to deal with that long term?
Yes, I've thought about this a lot, you guys, because basically it's just going to get worse over the next couple of years. So for a plan down the road so that we're not in the same place this time next year as we were this year, I actually only had one employee that would have been impacted by the minimum wage increase, and we opted as part of our business plan to just not have that kennel position anymore. And we're going to be focusing on the idea of paying our people more and getting ahead of that curve, so still respecting them and their position and their training and all their background, and then kind of tightening up a little bit on the number of people we have. So focusing on a really highly motivated, highly trained, very well paid staff as opposed to tons of bodies in the room. which, you know, is something that's always given me great comfort. So it's a new direction for us. We are going to be cross-training. We've actually already started cross-training all of our support team members. So we have our doctors, we have our LVTs, and then we have support. And previously we had the front desk, and then we had the back office assistants. And now they are getting the training, they're going across the board, and I've let them know, you know, this is your opportunity for growth. If you want it, it's here, take it. You will be valued more, you will be a more valuable employee than you already are, because you'll be able to work all the way across the board, and regardless of however long you're here, or because we live in a high military community, if you're moving on, you'll be able to take all these skill sets with you. So it's really important to us that they know that we value them, and it's not just a money-saving technique to have less people in the hospital, but that we really want their experience here every day to be as fulfilling as possible. And when you work with good people, I feel like that just kind of happens. So that's our plan.
Thank you. And I love that you have a plan. So, and I think that's such an important part, is really to think about how are these changes going to impact us? How are we going to be able to deal with them and accommodate them? And that really comes back to, I know forecasting isn't necessarily everybody's favorite word, but really thinking to the future of what's going to happen, how is this going to impact us, how as a hospital are we going to be able to deal with that? Because part of that is that we do want to be able to have a solid team and strong people and provide the level of medicine that, you know, everybody's working there to do. So I'd say the further ahead you can think and really think about big picture, what's there every day. The same thing as, you know, if you guys know it's been a tough week or weather's been horrible and somebody calls in sick, it's always our first instinct, at least it was mine, like we have to get that shift covered, we have to get it covered. But is there circumstances or days where we don't need to get it covered? Will we be okay? Will we make sure that we're still providing that same level of medicine? And that's what, as managers, you really have the flexibility and the power to be able to really control and make those shifts. And so that's why I really think by using the staff budget workbook, you're really empowering yourselves to make those decisions. Because ultimately, if you're going to be within your budget and staying there, and you're going to make adjustments, if it's an hourly rate here or there, and we see that you're still well within budget, that's something that you're going to have the autonomy to do. But again, expect the unexpected. So if you're, you know, if we're making a bunch of adjustments and we know that we're losing a doctor or two doctors and they're not going to be there, that we're going to realize that we're not necessarily going to have the revenue or the capacity to keep up with that. Okay. Does everybody feel like they have the tools they need to complete a staff budget workbook if you haven't done so already?
Yeah.
Are there any other questions that you guys want to ask of me or of any of the other managers on the call? No? Okay, well, I appreciate everybody taking the time to do this today. I know it's not everybody's favorite subject, but I would just say, you know, if you don't have the workbook, create one, make it current, and if you have questions about it, happy to have a call to review that, whether it's with myself, Jake, or Danny. So thank you, everybody, for your input today. Amanda, I appreciate you getting put on the spot and running with it, so I owe you.
You know, I love this stuff, you guys. So if you have any questions, you can always give me a call.
She does love it.
I do love it. I know.
Good. Okay, well, everybody enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Diana.
Thank you.
Okay, take care. Bye. Bye. Bye.